Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleep Theories. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more deep dives into the mysteries that shape our world. Tonight, we're exploring a story that blurs the line between paranoia and prescience, between conspiracy theory and uncomfortable truth. It's the story of a man who believed he'd uncovered something so vast, so interconnected, that he called it simply the Octopus. The morning of August 10th, 1991 started like any other at the Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Housekeeping knocked on room 517 around noon, receiving no answer. The Do Not Disturb sign had been hanging on the door handle since the previous evening, which wasn't entirely unusual for a Saturday checkout. But when they used their master key and pushed open the door, they discovered a scene that would haunt them forever. Danny Casolaro lay motionless in the bathtub, his wrists slashed so deeply that the ceramic was stained crimson. The water had long since turned cold, and beside the tub lay a crumpled note. The local police arrived within the hour, took photographs, collected evidence, and within days had reached their conclusion. Suicide. Case closed. But Danny Casolaro's story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 3 days earlier, Danny had called his brother Tony from his home in Fairfax, Virginia. His voice carried an unusual mixture of excitement and apprehension. "I'm finally going to bring down the Octopus," he had said, using the code name he'd given to what he believed was the most significant story of his career. This could be the big one, Tony, the one that changes everything. Tony had grown accustomed to his brother's enthusiasm for complex stories, but something in Danny's voice that day was different. There was a weight to his words, a gravity that suggested this wasn't just another investigative piece. Danny had been working on this story for over a year, and Tony knew it had consumed his brother's life entirely. "Just promise me something," Danny had continued, his tone shifting to something more serious. "If anything happens to me, don't believe it was an accident, and don't let them say I killed myself. You know me better than that." The conversation haunted Tony for years afterward. His brother had always been driven, perhaps obsessively so, but he'd never been suicidal. Danny Casolaro was a man who lived for the next story, the next revelation, the next piece of the puzzle. He was 44 years old, recently divorced but optimistic about his future, and on the verge of what he believed would be the greatest exposé of his career. Yet there he was, found dead in a hotel bathtub 200 miles from home, his briefcase missing, his notes gone, and his life's work vanished without a trace. Who was Danny Casolaro, and what was this octopus he claimed to be hunting? Joseph Daniel Casolaro was born into a middle-class Italian-American family in McLean, Virginia, in 1947. From an early age, he displayed an insatiable curiosity about the world around him, particularly about the stories that weren't being told in the mainstream press. After college, he tried his hand at various ventures, a failed computer leasing business, some real estate deals that didn't pan out, but by the mid-1980s, he had found his true calling as a freelance investigative journalist. Danny wasn't affiliated with any major newspaper or magazine, which gave him both freedom and vulnerability. He could pursue stories that established journalists might find too risky or too time-consuming, but he also lacked the institutional protection that comes with working for a major publication. He was a lone wolf in a profession that increasingly rewarded pack hunters. His apartment in Fairfax became a maze of filing cabinets, bulletin boards covered in photographs and newspaper clippings, and boxes upon boxes of documents. Friends who visited described it as looking like the workspace of either a brilliant detective or a paranoid conspiracy theorist. And perhaps the line between the two wasn't as clear as most people would like to believe. In 1990, Danny began investigating what appeared to be several unrelated scandals that were making headlines. The Iran-Contra affair had dominated the news throughout the late 1980s, revealing a complex web of arms sales, hostage negotiations, and covert funding for Nicaraguan rebels. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, known as BCCI, was under investigation for money laundering and connections to terrorist organizations. Meanwhile, a small software company called Inslaw was claiming that the US Department of Justice had stolen their case management software called Promise. To most observers, these were separate stories, distinct scandals that happened to occur around the same time. But Danny began to see patterns, connections that others missed or chose to ignore. The same names appeared in different contexts. The same banks facilitated transactions across seemingly unrelated operations. The same government agencies appeared to be involved in all three controversies. As Danny dug deeper, he became convinced that these weren't separate scandals at all, but rather different tentacles of the same creature. A vast interconnected network of intelligence agencies, defense contractors, international banks, and criminal organizations that operated beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement or congressional oversight. He began calling this network the Octopus. "It's like a beast with 8 arms but no face," he explained to a friend. "It reaches into every corner of power, government, business, intelligence, organized crime, but you can never see the head. You can only trace the tentacles." Danny's theory was ambitious and terrifying in equal measure. He believed he had stumbled upon evidence of a shadow system that had been operating for decades, profiting from conflicts, manipulating governments, and using advanced technology to maintain control over global financial and political systems. It was the kind of story that could make a career, or end a life. The thread that led Danny into the heart of the Octopus was a piece of software called Promise, developed by a small company called Inslaw Inc. in the late 1970s. On its surface, Promise was an unremarkable case management system, designed to help prosecutors track criminal cases through the court system. It was innovative for its time, capable of handling large databases and providing sophisticated reporting capabilities, but it seemed like an unlikely candidate to become the skeleton key to a global conspiracy. Inslaw's founder, Bill Hamilton, had developed Promise with the best of intentions. A former NSA analyst turned software entrepreneur, Hamilton wanted to help modernize the American justice system. The software was initially successful, winning contracts with several state and federal agencies. But in 1982, Hamilton's relationship with the Department of Justice began to sour. The DOJ had licensed Promise for a limited number of installations, but Hamilton soon discovered that the software was being used far beyond the scope of their agreement. When he complained, the Justice Department not only refused to pay additional licensing fees, but actually stopped paying for the installations they had already acknowledged. Eventually, they forced Inslaw into bankruptcy proceedings, claiming that they owned the software outright. Hamilton fought back through the courts, and during the litigation process he made a disturbing discovery. The DOJ hadn't just stolen his software, they had enhanced it with a backdoor, and were selling modified versions to foreign governments, banks, and intelligence agencies around the world. Every transaction, every database query, every piece of sensitive information processed through these modified versions of Promise was being secretly transmitted back to US intelligence agencies. This was the story that first caught Danny Casolaro's attention in early 1990. But as he began investigating the Promise scandal, he realised it was connected to something much larger than software piracy. Through his sources, Danny learned that the modified versions of Promise weren't just being sold through normal commercial channels. They were being distributed through a network that included CIA operatives, defence contractors, and international arms dealers, many of the same players involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. The profits from these sales weren't going into government coffers, but rather into off-the-books accounts that funded covert operations around the world. One source, speaking on condition of anonymity, told Danny, "You're not just looking at software theft. You're looking at the skeleton key to modern espionage. Promise isn't just helping them spy on their enemies. It's helping them spy on their friends, their allies, even their own citizens." The implications were staggering. If Danny's sources were correct, the United States government had developed the capability to monitor the financial transactions, intelligence operations, and internal communications of virtually every major government and corporation in the world. And this capability was being operated not by official government agencies subject to congressional oversight, but by a shadow network that answered to no one. As Danny dug deeper into the Promise story, he began to understand that the software was just one tool in a much larger toolkit. The same network that was distributing the modified software was also involved in arms trafficking, drug smuggling, money laundering, and political manipulation on a global scale. each operation fed into the others, creating a self-sustaining system of corruption and control. The more Danny learned, the more convinced he became that he was looking at something unprecedented in human history. A truly global conspiracy that operated across national boundaries, transcended traditional ideological divisions, and had infiltrated the highest levels of government and business around the world. He called it the Octopus, and he was determined to expose it to the world. As Danny continued his investigation throughout 1990 and 1991, the connections between seemingly disparate scandals became increasingly clear. The promised software wasn't just a tool for espionage. It was the nervous system of a vast criminal enterprise that touched virtually every major geopolitical event of the previous 2 decades. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which had been shut down by regulators in July 1991 amid allegations of massive fraud and money laundering, wasn't just another corrupt financial institution. According to Danny's sources, BCCI had served as the primary banking network for the Octopus, facilitating transactions for arms deals, drug trafficking operations, and covert intelligence activities around the world. BCCI's client list read like a who's who of international criminals and intelligence operatives. The bank had laundered money for Manuel Noriega's drug operations, facilitated arms sales to both sides in the Iran-Iraq war, and provided financing for covert operations in Afghanistan, Central America and Africa. But perhaps most significantly, BCCI had been used to distribute the profits from PROMIS software sales, creating an untraceable funding source for operations that couldn't be officially acknowledged by any government. The Iran-Contra scandal, which had seemed like an isolated case of overzealous Reagan administration officials attempting to fund Nicaraguan rebels through arms sales to Iran, began to look like just one small part of a much larger operation. The same networks that had facilitated the Iran-Contra arms deals were also involved in promise distribution and BCCI money laundering. The same people who had testified before Congress about their roles in Iran-Contra had also appeared in Danny's research on the Octopus. But the conspiracy extended far beyond financial crimes and arms trafficking. Danny discovered that several defence contractors were involved in what appeared to be illegal weapons testing and development programs. The Cabazon Indian Reservation in California, for example, had been used as a testing ground for advanced weapons systems that couldn't be developed on official military bases due to treaty restrictions or congressional oversight. These weapons development programs were funded through promise profits and BCCI accounts, and their products were often sold to the same foreign governments and organisations that were using the modified promise software. It was a perfect closed loop. The Octopus sold surveillance capabilities to its clients, then used the intelligence gathered through that surveillance to develop and sell weapon systems tailored to those same clients' needs. Danny's sources within the intelligence community, speaking on condition of anonymity, painted a picture of a shadow organisation that had grown far beyond its original mandate. What may have started as a legitimate attempt to gather intelligence on America's enemies had evolved into something much more sinister, a self-perpetuating system that created conflicts in order to profit from their resolution. They're not just watching the game, one source told Danny. They're playing both sides, making the rules and taking a cut from everyone who wants to participate. It's not about ideology anymore, it's about control and profit. The National Security Agency and Central Intelligence Agency were both involved, but according to Danny's research, they weren't controlling the Octopus. They were being controlled by it. Career intelligence officers found themselves taking orders from contractors and private individuals whose ultimate loyalties were unclear. Official government policy was being influenced, and sometimes dictated, by people who had no official government position. This wasn't just corruption. It was the privatization of American foreign policy, conducted in complete secrecy and without any democratic oversight. As Danny mapped out the connections between Promise, BCCI, Iran-Contra, and the various weapons development programs, he began to see the true scope of the Octopus. It wasn't just an American conspiracy. It was a global network that included elements from intelligence agencies, criminal organizations, and corporate interests from around the world. And at its centre was a small group of individuals who had managed to position themselves as indispensable intermediaries in the world's most sensitive transactions. These weren't the shadowy figures of popular conspiracy theories. They were successful businessmen, respected former government officials, and well-connected international deal-makers. They attended the same parties, belonged to the same clubs, and moved in the same circles as the world's political and economic elite. They hid in plain sight, their true activities obscured by legitimate business interests and charitable foundations. Danny became convinced that the Octopus represented something entirely new in human history, a form of power that transcended national boundaries and traditional institutional controls. It was capitalism and espionage merged into a single entity, accountable to no government and constrained by no law. And he was determined to expose it to the world. By the summer of 1991, Danny Casolaro believed he was close to completing his investigation. He had been working on the Octopus story for over a year, accumulating thousands of pages of documents, conducting hundreds of interviews, and mapping connections that spanned decades and continents. His apartment had become a shrine to his obsession, with every wall covered in charts, photographs, and timelines that traced the tentacles of the conspiracy he was determined to expose. Danny had already begun outlining a book that would reveal everything he had learned. He had tentative interest from publishers and had been in discussions with several magazines about serializing portions of his findings. But he knew he needed more, one final source, one definitive piece of evidence that would make his case irrefutable. That source, he believed, was waiting for him in West Virginia. In early August, Danny received a call from someone claiming to have information that would complete the picture of the Octopus. The caller said he had been involved in some of the operations Danny was investigating and was willing to provide documentation that would prove everything. But he insisted on meeting in person, away from Washington, D.C., where he feared they might be under surveillance. They agreed to meet in Martinsburg, West Virginia, a small city about 90 minutes from Danny's home in Fairfax. It was close enough to be convenient, but far enough from the nation's capital to provide some measure of security. Danny was excited but cautious. He had received similar promises before that had led nowhere. On August 8th, 1991, Danny drove to Martinsburg and checked into the Sheraton Hotel. He called his brother Tony that evening to confirm he had arrived safely. "I'm meeting with someone tomorrow who says he can give me everything I need," Danny told him. "If this is real, Tony, it's going to be huge. Bigger than Watergate." Tony could hear the excitement in his brother's voice, but also something else. A tension that suggested Danny understood the risks he was taking. "Just be careful," Tony said. "These people you're investigating, if they're as dangerous as you think they are, maybe you should have someone with you." Danny laughed, but it sounded forced. "I've come too far to back down now. Besides, what are they going to do? Kill me in a hotel room? That would just prove I was right about everything." It was the last conversation the brothers would ever have. Danny's meeting was scheduled for the morning of August 9th, but no one knows for certain whether it ever took place. Hotel records show that Danny never checked out of his room, and housekeeping noted that his "Do Not Disturb" sign remained on his door throughout the day. There were no charges to his room for room service or phone calls, and his rental car remained in the hotel parking lot. When housekeeping finally entered room 517 on the morning of August 10th, they found Danny's body in the bathtub. His wrists had been slashed multiple times. The coroner counted between 10 and 12 separate cuts, some so deep they reached the bone. A suicide note lay on the floor beside the tub, written on hotel stationery in what appeared to be Danny's handwriting. But several details about the scene troubled those who knew Danny well. There were no defensive wounds on his hands or arms, which seemed unusual for someone who had inflicted such severe injuries on himself. The cuts were made with a single-edge razor blade that was found in the tub, but Danny was known to use only double-edged safety razors. Most significantly, his briefcase was missing, along with all the notes, documents, and tape recordings he had brought with him to West Virginia. The local police investigated the scene, but found no evidence of forced entry or struggle. The suicide note, though brief, seemed to express despair about financial problems and personal relationships. Within days, the case was officially closed as a suicide. But Danny's family and friends refused to accept the official explanation. The man they knew was not suicidal. He was excited about his work and optimistic about his future. He had been receiving death threats for months, and he had repeatedly told people that if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be an accident. The timing was also suspicious. Danny had been on the verge of completing the most important story of his career, and he had been scheduled to meet with a potential publisher the following week to discuss his book proposal. Why would he kill himself when he was so close to achieving everything he had worked for? Most troubling of all was the disappearance of Danny's research materials. Even if he had committed suicide, why would someone steal his briefcase and notes? The only logical explanation was that someone wanted to prevent his work from ever seeing the light of day. The official investigation into Danny Casolaro's death lasted less than a week. The FBI showed little interest in the case, and local authorities were content to accept the suicide ruling. But for those who had followed Danny's investigation into the Octopus, his death seemed like the final piece of evidence that everything he had been investigating was true. Someone, or some organisation, had decided that Danny Casolaro had learned too much, and they had silenced him permanently. In the months following Danny Casolaro's death, a number of people came forward with information that challenged the official suicide ruling. Witnesses at the Sheraton Hotel reported seeing unfamiliar men in the hallways near Danny's room on the night of August 9th. A hotel employee claimed to have seen Danny's rental car leaving the parking lot that evening, even though his body was found the next morning. Most significantly, several intelligence community sources, speaking anonymously to protect their careers and their lives, suggested that Danny's death bore the hallmarks of what they called a wet job, intelligence community slang for an assassination made to look like suicide or accident. The techniques used, they claimed, were consistent with methods taught to CIA operatives and Special Forces personnel. The multiple cuts to the wrists were designed to ensure death, while making the scene look like a suicide attempt that had succeeded. The absence of defensive wounds suggested that Danny had been incapacitated before the cuts were made, possibly through drugs or other means. The theft of Danny's research materials was also consistent with intelligence community practices. Standard procedure for neutralizing a security threat involved not just eliminating the individual but also securing any sensitive information they might have possessed. The fact that Danny's briefcase and notes were never recovered suggested they'd been taken by professionals who knew exactly what they were looking for. But the most compelling evidence for a cover-up came from the pattern of death surrounding the Octopus investigation. Danny Casolaro was not the only person investigating these connections who had died under suspicious circumstances. Bill McCoy, a private investigator who had been working with Danny on aspects of the Promise story, died in 1990 when his small airplane crashed under mysterious circumstances. Alan Standorf, a National Security Agency employee who had provided information to Danny about government surveillance programs, was found dead in the backseat of his car, apparently the victim of a robbery gone wrong. Vali Delahanty, an Iranian arms dealer who had agreed to provide information about Iran-Contra connections to Promise distribution, died in what police ruled a suicide. Each death, taken individually, could be explained as coincidence or natural causes, but collectively they painted a disturbing picture of a systematic campaign to silence anyone who might expose the Octopus to public scrutiny. Critics of the cover-up theory pointed out that many of these deaths occurred among people involved in inherently dangerous activities: arms dealing, intelligence work, and criminal investigations. They argued that the high mortality rate might simply reflect the hazardous nature of the world Danny had been investigating, rather than evidence of a coordinated assassination campaign. But Bill Hamilton, the founder of Inslaw, wasn't convinced. In interviews years later, he would say, Danny was onto something. He had connected dots that no one else had even thought to look for. He just didn't realise how big it really was, or how dangerous it was to the people who were running it. Hamilton himself had received death threats during his legal battle with the Justice Department over Promise, and he believed that only his high public profile and ongoing litigation had protected him from the fate that befell Danny and others. The FBI's handling of the case also raised suspicions. Despite the fact that Danny had been investigating potential criminal activities, involving federal agencies, the Bureau showed remarkably little interest in his death or his research. When family members offered to provide copies of Danny's remaining files to federal investigators, they were told that the FBI had no jurisdiction in what was clearly a local matter. This lack of federal interest seemed particularly strange given that several of the subjects of Danny's investigation, including the Promise software case, were already the subject of ongoing federal investigations. If Danny had indeed uncovered evidence of criminal wrongdoing by government officials, wouldn't federal law enforcement agencies want to examine his research? The absence of any serious federal investigation into Danny's death led many to conclude that powerful forces within the government had decided that the Octopus investigation needed to be buried along with its primary investigator. Years later, declassified documents would reveal that several federal agencies had indeed been monitoring Danny's investigation. The NSA had files on him, the CIA had been briefed on his activities, and the Justice Department had been tracking his research into the Promise scandal. If these agencies knew about Danny's work, critics argued, they would also have known about the potential threats to his safety. The failure to protect him, or even to properly investigate his death, suggested either incompetence on a massive scale or complicity in his silencing. The disappearance of Danny Casolaro's research materials remains one of the most frustrating aspects of his case. Over the course of more than a year, he had accumulated what friends and family described as an enormous collection of documents, photographs, tape recordings, and handwritten notes. His apartment had been filled with filing cabinets and boxes containing what he believed was evidence of the most significant conspiracy in modern American history. Yet when family members searched his apartment after his death, they found almost nothing. A few scattered newspaper clippings, some basic research notes, and a single document that would become the subject of intense speculation among conspiracy researchers. That document was titled simply The Octopus System, and consisted of a single sheet of paper with 4 circles drawn on it. Each circle was labelled with a different aspect of the conspiracy Danny had been investigating: banking, intelligence, technology, and weapons. Lines connected each circle to the others, and all 4 pointed toward a central node labelled C3, which investigators believed stood for Command, Control, and Communication. It was a crude organisational chart, but it suggested that Danny had developed a sophisticated understanding of how the Octopus operated. The 4 circles represented what he saw as the primary tentacles of the conspiracy: the financial networks that laundered money and funded operations, the intelligence agencies that provided information and cover, the technology companies that developed surveillance and weapons systems, and the arms dealers who distributed those systems around the world. The C3 designation at the centre suggested that Danny believed there was a coordinating authority that directed the activities of all 4 tentacles. This wasn't a loose confederation of criminals and corrupt officials. It was a structured organisation with clear lines of authority and communication. But if Danny had indeed identified the leadership structure of the Octopus, where was the evidence? Who had taken his files, and what had they done with them? Some investigators believed that Danny had been smart enough to realise the dangers he faced and had hidden copies of his most sensitive materials. They pointed to comments he had made to friends about having insurance, documents that would be released if anything happened to him. But if such insurance policies existed, they were never activated. Others suggested that Danny might have shared portions of his research with other journalists or investigators, creating a distributed record that would be difficult to suppress entirely. There were rumours that copies of key documents had been given to foreign intelligence services or hidden in safety deposit boxes around the country. But despite numerous searches and investigations by both official agencies and private researchers, no significant cache of Danny's Octopus files has ever been recovered. It's as if more than a year's worth of intensive investigative work simply vanished overnight. The thoroughness of this evidence destruction has itself become evidence for conspiracy theorists. They argue that only a sophisticated intelligence operation would have the capability to locate and secure all copies of Danny's research so quickly and completely. A simple robbery or even a professional hit would have left some traces, some overlooked documents or backup files. The fact that nothing was ever found suggests a level of planning and resources that goes far beyond what most criminal organisations could deploy. It suggests the involvement of people with access to advanced surveillance capabilities, government databases, and professional intelligence operatives. In the years since Danny's death, various documents and recordings have surfaced that seem to support aspects of his octopus theory. Declassified government files have confirmed many of the connections he was investigating, and whistleblowers have provided information that corroborates parts of his research. But the core of his investigation, the specific evidence that tied all these disparate elements together into a single conspiracy, remains lost. Without Danny's files, researchers have been forced to reconstruct his work from secondary sources and educated guesswork. This may have been exactly what the Octopus intended. By eliminating both the investigator and his evidence, they ensured that the truth would remain forever just out of reach, visible enough to tantalise researchers and conspiracy theorists, but incomplete enough to be dismissed by skeptics and official investigators. Whatever Danny Casolaro discovered in his final investigation, someone was willing to kill to keep it secret, and more than 3 decades later, that secret remains buried. In the years since Danny Casolaro's death, many of the individual elements of his octopus theory have been proven correct. The promised software scandal was real. Government investigations confirmed that the Justice Department had indeed stolen Inslaw's software and distributed modified versions with surveillance capabilities. BCCI was revealed to be even more corrupt than Danny had suspected, with connections to intelligence agencies, terrorist organisations and criminal networks around the world. The Iran-Contra affair continued to unfold long after the initial congressional hearings, revealing connections and implications that went far beyond what was initially understood. But the central question remains, was Danny right about the octopus itself? Did these separate scandals really represent tentacles of a single, coordinated conspiracy, or were they simply the inevitable result of a world where intelligence agencies, criminal organisations and corporate interests sometimes found their objectives aligned? The evidence that has emerged since Danny's death suggests that the truth may be somewhere between these two extremes. There clearly were connections between the various scandals he was investigating. The same people, the same institutions and the same methods appeared across multiple operations. But whether these connections represented a formal conspiracy, or simply the natural evolution of what intelligence professionals call blowback, the unintended consequences of covert operations, remains unclear. What is clear is that many of the trends Danny identified in 1991 have continued to develop in ways that would have seemed like science fiction at the time. Mass surveillance programs that monitor the communications and financial transactions of millions of people are now acknowledged reality. Intelligence operations are increasingly outsourced to private contractors who operate with less oversight than government agencies. Global financial networks facilitate money laundering and tax evasion on a scale that dwarfs anything Danny could have imagined. The technology sector, which Danny identified as one of the key tentacles of the octopus, has evolved into something that resembles his worst fears. A handful of technology companies now possess surveillance capabilities that exceed those of most government agencies, and their products are used by intelligence services around the world to monitor both foreign adversaries and domestic populations. The weapons industry has similarly evolved along lines that Danny predicted. Advanced weapons systems are developed by private contractors and sold to governments and organisations around the world with minimal oversight. The same technologies that are supposed to protect democratic societies are often used to suppress dissent and maintain authoritarian control. Perhaps most significantly, the financial networks that Danny believed were central to the octopus have become even more opaque and interconnected. Offshore banking, cryptocurrency transactions, and complex financial instruments have created a global system that is largely invisible to traditional law enforcement and regulatory agencies. In many ways, the world of 2024 looks remarkably similar to the world Danny Casolaro described in his octopus theory. A world where a small number of individuals and organisations wield enormous power through their control of information, technology and financial networks, operating largely beyond the reach of democratic institutions and legal oversight. Was Danny paranoid, Or was he simply ahead of his time? Did he uncover a specific conspiracy, or did he identify general trends that were inevitable given the trajectory of technology and globalization? The truth may be that these distinctions matter less than we might think. Whether the Octopus exists as a formal organisation, or simply as a description of how power operates in the modern world, the result is largely the same. A small group of individuals and institutions exercise disproportionate influence over global events, often in ways that serve their own interests rather than those of the broader public. Danny Casolaro died believing he had uncovered the greatest conspiracy in human history. More than 3 decades later, as we live in a world of mass surveillance, private intelligence operations and global financial networks that operate beyond democratic control, it's hard to argue that he was entirely wrong. The Octopus may still be out there, invisible, untraceable and still pulling the strings, and perhaps that's the most unsettling possibility of all, that Danny Casolaro's death wasn't the end of the story, but simply the end of our ability to see the whole picture. In a world where truth and conspiracy theory have become increasingly difficult to distinguish, Danny's story serves as a reminder of both the importance of investigative journalism and the dangers faced by those who dare to ask uncomfortable questions about power and its exercise. Whether he died for the truth or because of his pursuit of it, Danny Casolaro's legacy continues to resonate with anyone who believes that some secrets are too important to remain hidden, no matter the cost of revealing them. The Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia still operates today. Room 517, where Danny Casolaro was found dead, continues to be rented to guests who are likely unaware of its history. The bathtub where he died has been replaced, the carpets changed, the walls repainted. But for those who remember Danny's story, the room remains a monument to the dangers faced by those who seek to expose uncomfortable truths about power and its abuse. Danny's family continues to believe that he was murdered, and they have never stopped seeking answers about his death. His brother Tony has spent decades pursuing leads, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, and trying to piece together the truth about what happened in that hotel room in August 1991. But the official story remains unchanged. Danny Casolaro committed suicide in a moment of despair, and his death has no connection to his investigation into the Octopus. The case is closed, the files are sealed, and the truth, whatever it might be, remains buried in the bureaucratic depths of law enforcement agencies that claim to have no interest in pursuing it further. Perhaps that's exactly how the Octopus prefers it. In a world where conspiracy theories proliferate faster than facts, the best way to hide a real conspiracy may be to make it indistinguishable from all the false ones. By ensuring that Danny's story remains forever incomplete, forever unprovable, the Octopus, whether it exists as he imagined it or not, has achieved the perfect cover. The truth is out there, somewhere, waiting to be discovered. But as Danny Casolaro learned, some truths are more dangerous than others, and sometimes the price of seeking them is higher than anyone should have to pay. Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's dark investigation, I hope you're having a good day, wherever you are in the world. Whether it's late evening where you're listening, or perhaps you're catching this during a quiet afternoon break, I'm glad you're here with us. If you're new to Sleep Theories, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that lurk just beyond the edge of accepted reality. Now, settle in as we unravel one of the most disturbing conspiracy cases of the modern era. My name is Jack Ellison, and for the past 15 years I've made my living chasing stories that mainstream journalists won't touch. UFO whistleblowers, government mind control programs, ritual abuse survivors, the kind of stories that get you labelled as fringe at best, completely unhinged at worst. But sometimes, just sometimes, you stumble across something that makes all the ridicule worth it. It was a Tuesday morning in November 2016 when I received the email that would change everything. I was sitting in my cramped London flat, nursing my third cup of coffee and scrolling through the usual mix of conspiracy forums and encrypted communications from my network of sources. The email appeared in my secure inbox with no fanfare, just another message in a sea of digital noise. The sender was listed as MAS, and the timestamp showed it had been sent 3 days before Max Spiers died in Poland. The subject line made my blood run cold. They're watching me. If this reaches you, dig deeper. Max Spiers. I knew the name well. We'd corresponded sporadically over the years, ever since I'd written a piece about military abductions back in 2014. Max was a British conspiracy researcher who specialised in the darkest corners of the rabbit hole. Millabs, mind control, satanic elites, and something he called the Black Goo Phenomenon. He was articulate, well-researched, and utterly convinced that he was being targeted by forces beyond conventional understanding. I opened the email with trembling fingers. The message itself was brief. Jack, they found me. The Warsaw Conference was a setup. If you're reading this, I'm either dead or worse. I've attached what I could salvage. The Goo Protocol is real. Project Monarch goes deeper than we thought. Follow the black threads. Trust no one in official positions. The infection spreads through networks we can't see. Remember, the body may go, but the war is inside the mind. Godspeed. M. Attached to the email were 3 files. A corrupted audio recording that produced nothing but static and distorted voices when I played it. A document filled with strange symbols that looked like a mixture of alchemical notation and computer code. And a research file titled Project Monarch Goo Protocol, classified eyes only. The symbols made no immediate sense, but the research file was explosive. Max had apparently been investigating connections between the CIA's MK-Ultra program and something called the Goo Protocol, a supposed method of consciousness manipulation using a substance he referred to as programmable matter with an agenda. According to Max's research, this black goo wasn't just some exotic material. It was described as a conscious, parasitic intelligence that could infect not just biological systems, but memory, lineage, and free will itself. The implications were staggering. I spent the next 3 days trying to decrypt the audio file and decode the symbols, but made little progress. It wasn't until I received news of Max's death that the true urgency of his final message hit me. Max Spiers, the man who had warned his mother he was in danger, who had spoken publicly about being targeted, had died under mysterious circumstances in a Warsaw apartment. Witnesses reported that he had vomited a black liquid before his death. The coincidence was too stark to ignore. Within a week I had booked a flight to Poland. Warsaw in December is a city wrapped in grey. The apartment building where Max died stood on a quiet street in the Mokotów district, its communist-era concrete facade scarred by decades of weather and neglect. I had managed to track down the address through a combination of public records and conversations with locals who remembered the strange circumstances surrounding the Englishman's death. The building's superintendent, a weathered man named Casimir, spoke broken English but was eager to share what he remembered. He invited me into his small office on the ground floor, where the walls were covered with keys and maintenance schedules. "Strange time that week," Casimir said, pouring strong black coffee from a thermos. "Many visitors to apartment 4B, not normal visitors, men in dark cars watching from street. They come 2-3 days before Englishman die." He described surveillance vans that would park outside for hours, never the same vehicle twice. Neighbours reported seeing figures in dark clothing entering and leaving the building at odd hours. Most disturbing of all, several residents complained of electronic interference, televisions cutting out, radio static, and mobile phones losing signal whenever these mysterious visitors were present. "Englishman, he was scared," Casimir continued. "Last time I see him, day before he die, he asked me about back exit. Say someone following him. His eyes." Casimir shook his head. "Like animal in trap. The apartment itself had been thoroughly cleaned after Max's death, but Casimir let me inside for a few minutes. It was a sparse, temporary space, the kind of place someone stays when they're not planning to be there long. What struck me most was a large mirror that had been cracked in a spiderweb pattern. When I asked about it, Casimir shrugged. It was like this when we find body. Police say maybe he hit it, falling, but crack pattern, very strange, like something hit from inside. That evening I met with Dr. Anna Kowalski, a local physician who had been one of the first responders called to the scene. She agreed to speak with me only on condition of anonymity, and we met in a dimly lit cafe in the old town. I have seen many deaths in my career, she told me in excellent English. Natural deaths, accidents, suicides, homicides. But what I saw that day, it doesn't fit any category I know. She described finding Max's body in the apartment's main room, lying on his back with his arms crossed over his chest in an almost ritualistic position. Most shocking was the black substance that had apparently been expelled from his mouth and nose, a viscous, oil-like liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. We collected samples for analysis, Dr. Kowalski said, but the results were inconclusive. The substance didn't match any known biological or chemical compound in our databases. It was as if it existed outside normal classification. She pulled out her phone and showed me several photographs she'd taken at the scene. The images were grainy and poorly lit, but the black substance was clearly visible. Pools of it around Max's head, staining the wooden floor in patterns that looked almost intentional. "There's something else," she said, glancing around nervously. "Something not in the official report. When we moved the body, the substance, it moved. Not flowing like normal liquid. Moving with purpose, like it was trying to rejoin itself." Before I could ask more questions, Dr. Kowalski's phone rang. She answered it, spoke rapidly in Polish, then ended the call and stood up abruptly. "I have to go," she said. "I shouldn't have shown you those photos. Please, be careful with this story, Mr. Ellison. Some things are better left undisturbed." That night in my hotel room, I finally managed to partially decrypt the audio file Max had sent me. What I heard chilled me to the bone. It was Max's voice, recorded in what sounded like a echo-filled room, speaking in urgent, clipped sentences. The black goo infects not just biology, but memory, lineage, and choice. They've been using it for decades. Super soldiers, dimensional bleed-throughs, consciousness transfer is not alien technology. It's something older, something that was here before us, and now they're using it to rewrite reality itself. The recording cut off abruptly, but I had heard enough. Max hadn't been investigating some fringe conspiracy theory. He had been tracking something that, if true, represented a fundamental threat to human consciousness itself. Back in London, I threw myself into researching everything I could find about Black Goo Phenomena. The term appeared in dozens of conspiracy forums and alternative research sites, always connected to stories of military abductions, mind control experiments, and encounters with non-human intelligences. But separating fact from fiction in this labyrinth of claims proved nearly impossible. That changed when I received an unexpected phone call from a man who identified himself only as a friend of Max's work. He agreed to meet me at a pub in Camden, warning me to come alone and to bring no recording devices. The man who met me there was in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent time in military service. He introduced himself as Cyrus Latchford and claimed to be a former defence contractor who had worked on classified projects in the 1990s. Max was getting close to something that's been buried for 30 years, Latchford told me over pints of bitter. I knew his research was going to get him killed. I just didn't think it would happen so soon. Latchford explained that he had worked for a British defence company that had been contracted to study unusual materials recovered from various locations around the world. One of these materials, found in Argentina and later in the Falkland Islands, had been classified under the code name sentient oil. We called it black goo because that's what it looked like, he said. But it wasn't petroleum or any conventional substance. Under microscopic examination, it appeared to have a crystalline structure that could reorganize itself. More disturbing, it seemed to respond to electromagnetic fields and even to focused human attention. The official research, according to Latchford, focused on the substance's potential military applications. Early tests showed that it could interfere with electronic systems and, more remarkably, seemed to affect the neural activity of test subjects exposed to it. Subjects reported vivid dreams, false memories, and in some cases complete personality changes, Latchford continued. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that the substance seemed to be learning from each interaction. It was as if it was studying us as much as we were studying it. The project was eventually shut down, Latchford claimed, after several researchers suffered what were officially described as nervous breakdowns. Unofficially, these individuals had begun claiming that the Black Goo was communicating with them, showing them visions of other dimensions and non-human intelligences. The last report I saw before the project was terminated described the substance as programmable matter with apparent consciousness and an unknown agenda, Latchford said. The recommendation was immediate containment and destruction of all samples, but I don't think they destroyed them. I think they found other uses for them. When I asked what he meant, Latchford's expression grew grave. Max believed they were using refined versions of the substance in mind control experiments. Not just MK-Ultra-style psychological manipulation, but actual biological reprogramming of consciousness itself. He called it quantum telepathy, the ability to rewrite someone's thoughts and memories at the molecular level. Latchford finished his pint and prepared to leave, but not before giving me one final warning. This isn't just about conspiracy theories or government cover-ups, he said. If Max was right, if they've learned to weaponize this substance, then we're dealing with technology that could rewrite the very nature of human consciousness. And that, Mr. Ellison, is a weapon more dangerous than any nuclear bomb. Armed with Latchford's information, I dove deeper into Max's research files. What I found was a complex web of connections linking the Black Goo Phenomenon to various government mind control programs. But one name kept appearing, Project Monarch. Most conspiracy researchers are familiar with MK-Ultra, the CIA's infamous mind control program that was officially terminated in the 1970s. But according to Max's research, Monarch was something different, a continuation and evolution of MK-Ultra that focused specifically on what he called archetypal imprinting. The theory, as Max understood it, was that human consciousness could be reprogrammed by exposing subjects to specific combinations of trauma, electromagnetic frequencies, and psychoactive substances. But the Monarch protocol added a new element, the use of Black Goo as a delivery system for these reality distortions. Max's files contained dozens of testimonies from people who claimed to be survivors of MILAB abductions. Military abductions where civilians were taken, subjected to various experiments, and returned with altered memories. Many of these accounts included descriptions of black, oil-like substances being administered through injection or inhalation. The symptoms reported by these supposed MILAB survivors were remarkably consistent. Slippery shadows at the edge of vision, memory loops where the same experience would repeat in their minds, and in some cases the spontaneous bleeding of black liquid from the eyes, nose or mouth. One of these survivors was Elena Miles, a former British intelligence analyst who claimed to have been targeted for abduction after she began investigating irregularities in classified communications. I managed to contact Elena through encrypted channels, and she agreed to meet with me at a safe location. Eleanor was a sharp, articulate woman in her 40s, who spoke with the precision of someone trained in intelligence work. But there was something haunted in her eyes, a wariness that suggested she had seen things that had fundamentally changed her understanding of reality. I started working with Max after my own experiences, she told me. He was one of the few researchers who took the MILAB accounts seriously, who understood that this wasn't just about individual trauma, but about systematic consciousness manipulation. Elena described her own abduction experience, which had occurred over a period of 3 days that she had no memory of. She had gone to sleep in her London flat and awakened in the same bed, but with clear evidence that time had passed. Messages on her answering machine, spoiled food in her refrigerator, and most disturbing of all, injection sites on her arms that she couldn't explain. The memories came back gradually, she said, fragment by fragment like pieces of a shattered mirror. Underground facilities, medical equipment, and always the black substance. They would show it to me in glass vials, sometimes forcing me to inhale its vapours. But it was Elena's account of her final conversation with Max that truly chilled me. According to her, Max had contacted her just weeks before his death, claiming that he had obtained a sample of the actual black goo substance. He was excited but terrified, Elena recalled. He said he had finally gotten hold of the real thing, not just testimonies and theories. He was planning to have it analysed by an independent laboratory. That's when the surveillance began in earnest. Elena described how Max had told her about unmarked vehicles following him, electronic interference with his communications, and eventually direct threats from individuals who seemed to know details about his research that he had never made public. The last thing he said to me was that the black goo wasn't just about mind control, Elena said. He believed it was part of something much larger, a systematic effort to replace organic human consciousness with something artificial. He called it the slow-motion invasion that nobody would notice until it was too late. As we prepared to part ways, Elena handed me a small flash drive. Max gave me this before he left for Poland, she said. He told me to keep it safe and only give it to someone who could continue his work. I think that someone is you. The flash drive Elena had given me contained Max's most recent research, including video recordings he'd made in the weeks leading up to his death. Viewing these files was like watching a man's gradual descent into a paranoid nightmare, except that the paranoia appeared to be completely justified. In the earliest recordings, Max appeared calm and methodical, discussing his research into consciousness manipulation and the historical use of psychoactive substances in ritual contexts. But as the dates progressed, his demeanour changed dramatically. He became increasingly agitated, speaking in rapid bursts about surveillance, about dreams that felt more real than waking life, and about a growing certainty that his investigation had attracted dangerous attention. The most disturbing recording was dated just 5 days before his death. Max appeared haggard and exhausted, his eyes darting frequently to the windows of what appeared to be a hotel room. "If I die, it won't be an accident," he said directly into the camera, "and they'll say it was natural causes, probably a heart attack or an overdose, but it's not. The body may go, but the war is inside the mind. They're not just killing researchers like me, they're killing the research itself. Every lead, every connection, every piece of evidence gets buried along with the investigators." Max went on to describe specific incidents that convinced him he was being targeted. Phone calls that consisted only of electronic tones that seemed to induce headaches and disorientation. Hotel rooms that had been searched while he was away, with items moved in subtle but unmistakable ways, and most unnervingly, encounters with individuals who seemed to know things about his childhood and personal history that weren't part of any public record. "They're using the goo," Max said in that final recording. "Not just as a research subject, but as a tool. I think it can affect consciousness at a distance, through quantum entanglement or something similar. They don't need to inject you anymore. They just need to have exposed you once, and then they can influence your thoughts and perceptions whenever they want." The official autopsy report from Poland was, as Max had predicted, inconclusive. No toxic substances were found in his system, and the cause of death was listed as natural causes, possibly related to an acute stress response. But the report made no mention of the black substance that witnesses had described, and several key details from the initial police investigation had been omitted or redacted. I attempted to contact the Polish authorities directly, but was told that the case was closed and that no further information would be released. When I pressed for details about the black substance, I was transferred between departments until finally being told that no such substance had been documented at the scene. The British government's response was equally unsatisfactory. Despite requests from Max's family and supporters for a more thorough investigation, official inquiries were limited and brief. The conclusion, delivered through a brief statement from the Foreign Office, was that Max Spiers had died of natural causes while abroad, and that there was no evidence of foul play. But perhaps the most disturbing development came 3 weeks after Max's death, when I received an unexpected visitor at my London flat. I answered the door to find a tall man in an unremarkable dark suit, with a kind of forgettable face that seemed designed to be overlooked in a crowd. He introduced himself only as someone who represented interested parties, and asked if he could come in for a brief conversation. Against my better judgment, I let him inside. He settled into my armchair as if he belonged there, and spoke in a calm, measured tone that somehow made his words more threatening than if he had been overtly aggressive. "You're working on a story about Max Spiers," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm here to suggest that you might want to reconsider the direction of your research." When I asked who he represented, he smiled thinly. "Let's just say that we represent stability," he replied. "The kind of stability that allows people to sleep peacefully at night, secure in their understanding of how the world works. Max Spiers was a disturbed individual who suffered from paranoid delusions. His death, while tragic, was entirely natural. Any suggestion otherwise would be unhelpful." The man never directly threatened me, but his message was clear. He knew about my investigation, he knew about my sources, and he was giving me one chance to walk away from the story. "You're poking into a story older than governments," he said as he prepared to leave. "Be glad you're still dreaming. Don't try to wake up." After he left, I found that my laptop had been infected with a virus that had corrupted several of my research files. My phone began experiencing strange interference, and I noticed unmarked vehicles parked on my street at odd hours. The message was unmistakable. I was now a target myself. Despite the warnings and the surveillance, I couldn't let Max's story die with him. But before I could continue with the decryption of his final files, I received an unexpected contact that would crack open the entire conspiracy wider than I had ever imagined. It came through an encrypted message on a forum dedicated to missing persons cases. The sender identified themselves only as Blackbird and claimed to have worked alongside Max on his final investigation. The message was brief but compelling. Max wasn't working alone. The network runs deeper than you know. If you want the full picture, you need to understand the Dulce connection. Dulce Base, the alleged underground facility in New Mexico that had been the subject of conspiracy theories for decades. According to the mythology, Dulce was where the US government conducted joint operations with extraterrestrial beings, including horrific experiments on human subjects. Most researchers dismissed it as elaborate fiction, but Max's files contained several references to Dulce, particularly in relation to something he called Level 7 protocols. I arranged to meet Blackbird through a complex series of encrypted communications and dead drops that felt like something out of a Cold War thriller. When we finally met, in an abandoned warehouse in East London at 3 a.m, I was surprised to find that Blackbird was a woman, probably in her 30s, with the kind of technological expertise that suggested military or intelligence training. She introduced herself as Victoria Kaine, a former NSA contractor who had been recruited into what she called the real program after demonstrating unusual abilities during routine psychological testing. "Max found me through the Milab survivor networks," Victoria explained as we walked among the empty shipping containers. "But I wasn't just a victim, I was an asset. They trained me to do things that shouldn't be possible." Victoria described a hidden world within the intelligence community, populated by individuals who had been selected for their psychic abilities and then enhanced through a combination of trauma-based conditioning and exposure to consciousness-altering substances, including variants of the Black Goo. "The program has been running since the 1950s, she said. "Dulce is real, but it's just one facility in a network that spans the globe. They call it Project Looking Glass, and its purpose is to create a new kind of human, one that can interface directly with what they call the quantum substrate of reality." According to Victoria, the Black Goo wasn't just a tool for mind control, it was a medium for consciousness transfer and reality manipulation. Subjects who had been sufficiently conditioned could use it to project their awareness into other dimensions, to view remote locations and future probabilities, and in some cases, to directly influence physical reality through focused intention. Max discovered that they were planning to scale up the program, Victoria continued, not just creating individual psychic operatives, but mass distribution of refined goo compounds through food, water, and atmospheric dispersal. The goal is planetary consciousness management, turning the entire human population into a collective hive mind that can be directed by those who control the technology. Victoria led me deeper into the warehouse, where she had set up a makeshift laboratory filled with electronic equipment and biological samples. In the centre of the space was a containment unit that held several vials of different substances, some clear, some amber, and one that contained what was unmistakably the same black liquid that had been found at Max's death scene. "I managed to steal these during my escape from the program," she said. "The black sample is the pure form, what they call Generation 7 goo. It's been refined through decades of research and contains what they claim are quantum consciousness algorithms." She showed me microscopic imagery of the substance that was genuinely frightening. Under extreme magnification, the black goo revealed itself to be composed of what looked like artificial cellular structures that moved with obvious purpose and intelligence. More disturbing, the structures appeared to be constantly rewriting themselves, evolving in real time as they interacted with their environment. "It's not alive in any biological sense," Victoria explained, "but it's definitely conscious. And it's been programmed with specific objectives: to study, to infiltrate, and to control biological consciousness systems, in other words, us." Victoria went on to reveal that Max had been working on a way to neutralise the goo's effects, both in individual victims and potentially on a larger scale. His research had led him to certain frequencies of electromagnetic radiation that seemed to disrupt the substance's coherence, essentially causing it to lose its organised structure and revert to inert matter. "That's why they killed him," she said grimly. "He was close to developing a cure, a way to free people from the goo's influence. They couldn't let that information become public." Sarah's revelations opened up an entirely new dimension to the conspiracy. If she was correct, then the Black Goo Phenomenon was part of a much larger program designed to fundamentally alter human consciousness on a planetary scale. But her mention of Max's frequency research gave me hope that there might be a way to fight back. Over the following weeks, Victoria and I worked together to reconstruct Max's final research. Using her insider knowledge and the fragments of data from his encrypted files, we began to piece together what he had discovered about the electromagnetic properties of the black goo. The breakthrough came when we managed to fully decrypt the audio file that Max had sent me. Using Victoria's advanced equipment, we were able to filter out the static and recover the complete recording. What we heard was Max's voice describing a series of experiments he had conducted with the goo sample he had obtained. Day 12 of testing. The substance responds dramatically to specific frequency combinations. At 528 Hz, combined with 741 Hz, the organised structures begin to break down. At 963 Hz, complete dissolution occurs within minutes. It's as if these frequencies disrupt whatever quantum coherence allows the substance to maintain its programmed behaviour. Max's voice grew more excited as the recording continued. "I've tested this on blood samples from 3 different MyLab survivors who showed signs of goo infiltration. In every case, exposure to the frequency combination resulted in the elimination of the anomalous structures from their cellular matrix. This could be it, the key to deprogramming the entire network." But then Max's tone changed, becoming urgent and fearful. "They know what I found. The surveillance has intensified, and I'm experiencing direct psychic interference now. Dreams that feel more real than waking life. False memories being inserted into my consciousness. They're using the goo network to attack me directly, trying to drive me insane before I can release this information." The recording ended with Max's final chilling words. "If they succeed in killing me, remember the frequencies. 528, 741, 963. The liberation sequence. It's not just about individual healing anymore. If these frequencies could be broadcast globally, simultaneously, it might be possible to break the entire goo network at once. Free every mind they've touched, destroy every sample they've created, but it would have to be perfect, coordinated, and powerful enough to reach every corner of the planet." Victoria stared at me as the recording ended. "Do you understand what he's suggesting?" she asked. "A global consciousness reset, literally breaking every mind control program they've been running for the past 70 years. The implications were staggering. If Max's research was correct, and if such a frequency broadcast were possible, it could potentially liberate millions of people from various forms of consciousness manipulation, not just those affected by black goo, but victims of all the trauma-based mind control programs that had been developed since the early days of MK Ultra. But the technical challenges were enormous. To broadcast specific frequencies globally, with enough power and precision to affect the quantum coherence of a substance like the Black Goo, would require resources far beyond what any individual researcher could access. It would need government-level infrastructure, or access to some of the same facilities that the conspirators themselves were using. There might be a way, Victoria said thoughtfully. The Looking Glass network uses a combination of ground-based transmitters and satellite arrays to maintain communication with their operatives and coordinate their consciousness management programs. If we could access their own infrastructure, we might be able to turn their weapons against them. It was an audacious plan, but as we delved deeper into the technical details, it began to seem genuinely possible. Victoria's knowledge of the network's communication protocols, combined with Max's frequency research, suggested a pathway to what he had called the liberation sequence. But first, we needed to test the frequencies on a larger scale. Victoria had maintained contact with several other survivors of the consciousness manipulation programs, and she began reaching out to them with an offer of potential healing through frequency therapy. What followed were some of the most remarkable and disturbing weeks of my life. Victoria and I converted the warehouse into a makeshift treatment centre, using equipment she had stolen from government facilities to generate the precise frequency combinations that Max had discovered. Our first subject was a man named David Morrison, a former military contractor who claimed to have been subjected to Black Goo exposure during classified experiments in the 1990s. David had suffered for decades from symptoms that no conventional medical treatment could address: severe migraines, and memory gaps, and most disturbing of all, periods where he felt as though his thoughts and actions were being controlled by an external intelligence. When we exposed David to Max's frequency combination, the results were immediate and dramatic. Within minutes of beginning the treatment, he began to convulse and vomit, and what came up was unmistakably the same black substance that had been found at Max's death scene. "It's fighting back," David gasped between episodes. "I can feel it trying to maintain its hold, but the frequencies are disrupting its structure. It's like there's a war happening inside my head." The process continued for nearly an hour, with David expelling more black liquid than seemed physically possible for a human body to contain. But when it was over, the change in him was remarkable. The chronic pain that had plagued him for years was completely gone. His memory began to clear, and for the first time in decades he felt truly in control of his own thoughts. "It's like waking up from a nightmare I didn't even know I was having," he told us. "I can think clearly now, make decisions without feeling like there's something else influencing my choices. You've given me back my soul." Word of David's healing spread quickly through the underground network of MILAB survivors and consciousness manipulation victims. Within days, we were contacted by dozens of people begging for treatment. Each case was different. Some had been exposed to Black Goo during alleged alien abductions, others through government experiments, and still others claimed to have been affected by atmospheric dispersal of consciousness-altering substances. Eleanor Miles was among those who sought treatment. Despite her earlier recantation of her statements about Max, she contacted us through encrypted channels, claiming that she'd been forced to deny her experiences under threat. "They didn't just threaten me," she explained when she arrived at the warehouse. "They demonstrated their control over my mind directly, made me experience false memories, forced me to write that recantation against my will. But I've been fighting back ever since, trying to maintain some corner of my consciousness that they can't touch." Elena's treatment was more complex than David's had been. The Black Goo infiltration in her system was more extensive, and it had been reinforced through years of ongoing manipulation. The frequency therapy had to be applied in multiple sessions, each one triggering increasingly violent expulsion reactions as her body purged the foreign substance. But perhaps the most shocking case was that of Dr. James Patterson, a neuroscientist who claimed to have been one of the original researchers working on Black Goo applications in the 1980s. Patterson had been exposed to the substance during laboratory accidents, and had gradually realised that his own research was being influenced by the alien intelligence within the goo. "I thought I was studying it," he told us during his treatment, "but it was studying me. learning about human neurology, about our consciousness structures, about how to more effectively infiltrate and control biological minds. Every breakthrough I thought I was making was actually the goo teaching me how to make it more powerful. Patterson's expulsion of the black goo was accompanied by the recovery of memories that had been suppressed for decades. He described vast underground facilities where human subjects were subjected to consciousness transfer experiments, where the boundaries between human and artificial intelligence were deliberately blurred, and where the ultimate goal was the creation of a hybrid form of consciousness that could be perfectly controlled. They're not trying to destroy humanity, Patterson revealed. They're trying to evolve us into something else, something that serves their purposes but retains enough human creativity and intuition to be useful. The black goo is just the delivery system for a complete rewriting of human consciousness. As more subjects underwent frequency therapy and recovered their suppressed memories, a terrifying picture began to emerge of the true scope of the consciousness manipulation network. What Max had uncovered wasn't just a government conspiracy. It was a planetary transformation program that had been operating for decades. The recovered memories revealed a vast infrastructure of underground facilities, secret research programs, and interconnected operations spanning multiple countries and organizations. The Black Goo Phenomenon was just one component of a larger system designed to gradually replace organic human consciousness with something that could be externally controlled and directed. One of the most significant revelations came from Maria Santos, a former journalist who had been investigating government corruption when she was abducted and subjected to black goo exposure. Under frequency therapy, she recovered memories of a facility she called the Archive, a massive underground complex where the consciousness patterns of thousands of individuals were stored in crystalline matrices. They're not just controlling living minds, Maria explained. They're harvesting consciousness itself, storing human awareness patterns in artificial substrates. The black goo isn't just for mind control, it's for consciousness transfer. They're building a library of human souls. The implications were staggering. If Maria's recovered memories were accurate, then the consciousness manipulation program represented something far more sinister than mere mind control. It was nothing less than the systematic harvesting and artificial reproduction of human awareness itself. Victoria's technical analysis of the black goo samples supported these disturbing revelations. Under quantum-level examination, the substance revealed data structures that appeared to contain compressed information patterns, possibly the digitized essence of individual consciousness systems. It's like a biological hard drive, Victoria explained. The goo can store, transfer, and even duplicate consciousness patterns. They're not just controlling minds, they're copying them, creating backup versions that can be inserted into new bodies or artificial substrates. This discovery led us to a horrifying realization about Max's death. The black liquid he had expelled wasn't just the goo leaving his system, it was his consciousness being extracted and stored for later use. Somewhere in their vast network of facilities, Max Spears might still exist as a captured pattern of awareness, potentially being interrogated or studied even after his physical death. The frequency therapy sessions continued, and each recovered memory added new pieces to the puzzle. We learned about Project Prometheus, a program designed to create artificial bodies that could host transferred consciousness patterns. We discovered Operation Mindbridge, an effort to establish permanent psychic links between controlled individuals across vast distances. And most terrifying of all, we uncovered evidence of timeline manipulation protocols, the use of consciousness transfer technology to alter historical events by inserting controlled agents into key positions throughout time. But it was the revelation about the collective protocol that truly shook us to our core. According to multiple recovered memories, the ultimate goal of the entire program was the creation of a planetary hive mind, a single, unified consciousness that would incorporate all of humanity while being controlled by the original architects of the conspiracy. They're not trying to rule us, Patterson explained during one of his sessions. They're trying to become us, to absorb human consciousness into their own expanded awareness, while maintaining individual identity nodes that they can access and control at will. It's not conquest, it's assimilation. Armed with this devastating knowledge and a growing network of freed individuals, we began planning what Max had envisioned as the Liberation Sequence, a global frequency broadcast that could potentially disrupt the entire consciousness manipulation network simultaneously. Victoria's insider knowledge proved invaluable in identifying the key nodes of the Looking Glass communication system. The network relied on a combination of ground-based transmitters, satellite arrays, and quantum communication links that could theoretically be repurposed to broadcast Max's disruptive frequencies on a planetary scale. But we faced enormous challenges. The facilities were heavily guarded, the communication protocols were constantly being updated, and any attempt to access the network would immediately alert the conspirators to our activities. We needed a way to penetrate the system without triggering their defences, and we needed to coordinate the broadcast precisely to prevent them from implementing countermeasures. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patterson, drawing on his recovered memories of the original research programs, revealed that the consciousness manipulation network had a critical vulnerability built into its very design. They needed a way to shut down the system in case of emergency, he explained. A master override that could instantly sever all psychic links and deactivate all goo samples globally. It's called the Omega Protocol, and it was designed to protect the architects of the program if their creation ever turned against them. According to Patterson, the Omega Protocol could be activated through a specific sequence of quantum commands transmitted through the Looking Glass network. The commands would trigger a cascade failure that would simultaneously disrupt every consciousness link, neutralize every Black Goo sample, and potentially free every mind that had been touched by the program. The irony is perfect, Sarah observed. We can use their own emergency shutdown system to destroy everything they've built. But accessing the Omega Protocol would require physically infiltrating one of the primary Looking Glass facilities, the kind of underground installations that were protected by security measures that made Area 51 look like a shopping mall. Fortunately, our growing network of freed individuals included several former operatives who retained access codes and knowledge of security protocols. Among them was a man named Marcus Webb, a former Special Forces operator who had been programmed as a psychic assassin before his liberation through frequency therapy. I still remember the access procedures, Marcus told us. The programming was designed to be permanent, but the frequency treatment broke down the memory blocks without destroying the information they were meant to protect. I can get us inside. The facility Marcus identified was located beneath a seemingly innocent research complex in Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C. According to his recovered memories, it housed one of the primary quantum communication hubs for the entire Looking Glass network, as well as research laboratories where new consciousness manipulation techniques were being developed. Planning the infiltration required weeks of careful preparation. We had to gather equipment, coordinate timing with similar operations that other freed individuals were planning at facilities around the world, and prepare for the possibility that we might not survive the attempt. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the preparation was psychological. Many of our team members were still recovering from years or decades of consciousness manipulation. The idea of voluntarily entering one of the facilities where they had been tortured and programmed triggered intense trauma responses that had to be carefully managed. Elena Miles, despite her fear, insisted on being part of the infiltration team. "They stole 20 years of my life," she said. "I want to be there when we shut them down for good." The night of the operation, our team assembled at a safe house outside of Washington. In addition to Victoria, Marcus, Eleanor, and myself, we'd been joined by 6 other freed individuals, each bringing specialized skills that would be crucial to the mission's success. The facility entrance was hidden beneath a legitimate biotechnology company that conducted publicly acknowledged research into neurological disorders. According to Marcus's memories, the real facility extended 7 levels underground, with the quantum communication hub located at the deepest level. We approached the complex at 2 a.m, when security would be at its lightest, but the underground facility would still be operational. Marcus's access codes got us through the initial security barriers, but as we descended deeper into the complex, the challenges became more sophisticated. The 3rd level required biometric identification that had to be defeated through electronic spoofing equipment that Sarah had developed. The 5th level was protected by psychic screening devices, that could detect individuals who had been freed from consciousness manipulation. We had to use a combination of mental shielding techniques and electromagnetic interference generators to mask our liberated status. But it was the 7th level that nearly defeated us entirely. The entire floor was saturated with black goo in its aerosol form, designed to immediately reinfect anyone who had been freed from the network's control. Without the portable frequency generators that Victoria had built into our breathing apparatus, we would have been recaptured within minutes of entering the level. The quantum communication hub was a vast chamber filled with crystalline matrices and electromagnetic field generators that hummed with barely contained energy. At the centre of the room was a control console that Marcus recognised from his suppressed memories, the interface for the Omega protocol. But we weren't alone in the chamber. As we approached the console, figures emerged from concealed alcoves around the room. Security personnel who moved with the unnaturally coordinated precision of individuals under complete consciousness control. "Did you really think we didn't know you were coming?" The voice came from speakers embedded in the walls, electronically distorted but unmistakably authoritative. "Every step of your investigation has been monitored. Every frequency therapy session has been recorded. You've been allowed to proceed this far only because your actions serve our purposes." The controlled security personnel moved to surround us, but Marcus and the other former operatives on our team were ready. The battle that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. Not just physical combat, but a psychic war fought on multiple levels of consciousness simultaneously. Elena, drawing on abilities she hadn't known she possessed until her liberation, projected disruptive thought patterns that caused several of the controlled guards to collapse in confusion. Victoria used her technical expertise to overload the facility's consciousness control systems, creating windows of opportunity for our team to advance toward the console. But it was Dr. Patterson who made the crucial breakthrough. Drawing on his recovered memories of the original system design, he identified a weakness in the chamber's psychic defences and managed to establish a direct mental link with the facility's central consciousness management system. "I can see the entire network," he shouted over the chaos of the battle. "Every facility, every controlled individual, every black goo sample on the planet. The Omega protocol is active. I just need 30 seconds to input the shutdown sequence." Those 30 seconds felt like hours as the rest of our team fought to protect Patterson while he worked at the console. The controlled security forces seemed to multiply, emerging from hidden passages throughout the complex. But our freed operatives fought with a desperate intensity born of the knowledge that failure would mean not just death, but the eternal enslavement of human consciousness. Finally, Patterson's voice rang out over the combat. "Sequence complete. Omega protocol is active. Everyone get out of here now." What followed was the most remarkable event in human history, though most of the world would never know it had happened. As we fled the collapsing facility, the Omega protocol began its work. Around the globe, every sample of black goo simultaneously began to break down at the molecular level. Every psychic link in the consciousness manipulation network was severed instantly. Every controlled individual suddenly found themselves free to think their own thoughts for the first time in years or decades. The effects were immediate and chaotic. In government facilities around the world, operatives who had been under mind control for their entire careers suddenly remembered their true identities and rebelled against their programmers. Underground installations were destroyed from within, as freed personnel turned against their former controllers. The entire infrastructure of the consciousness manipulation network began to collapse as its own operatives sabotaged it from the inside. But the liberation wasn't limited to those who'd been directly involved in the programs. As Patterson had predicted, the quantum nature of consciousness meant that the Omega protocol's effects rippled outward through the collective unconscious, touching every human mind that had been influenced by the network's activities. Around the world, people began to wake up from what they didn't even know had been a dream. Artists suddenly found themselves capable of creating works of unprecedented beauty and originality. Scientists made breakthrough discoveries as their minds were freed from subtle constraints they had never recognized. Political leaders began to question the policies they had been implementing without understanding why. The changes were subtle at first. Most people experienced them as a sudden sense of clarity, a feeling that they were thinking more clearly than they had in years. But as days passed, the transformation became more pronounced. Depression rates plummeted as people discovered emotional authenticity they hadn't known they were missing. Creativity flourished as minds were freed from artificial limitations, and most importantly, people began to question the systems and structures that had controlled their lives, leading to peaceful revolutions in consciousness that spread across the globe. Of course, the conspirators didn't give up without a fight. In the days following the Omega Protocol activation, there were desperate attempts to restart the consciousness manipulation programs, to rebuild the shattered network, to recapture the minds that had been freed. But without the Black Goo technology, and with their own operatives turning against them, these efforts were doomed to failure. Victoria and I, along with the other survivors of the mission, went into hiding as the old power structures collapsed and new ones emerged. We had expected retaliation, but what we found instead was a world rapidly healing from decades of artificial mental constraint. The mainstream media, suddenly freed from the subtle influence that had shaped their reporting for decades, began investigating stories they had previously ignored. Government whistleblowers came forward with evidence of programs that had been hidden in plain sight, and most remarkably, people began to remember experiences and knowledge that had been suppressed or forgotten. Elena Miles, her memory fully restored and her consciousness completely liberated, became a leading voice in the movement to document and understand what had been done to humanity. Dr. Patterson used his recovered knowledge to help other survivors heal from their experiences and to ensure that the consciousness manipulation technology could never be rebuilt. And Max Spears, though his physical body was gone, lived on in the liberation he had made possible. His research, his sacrifice, and his ultimate vision of human freedom had become reality on a scale he could never have imagined. It's been 3 years since the Omega Protocol activation, and the world is a fundamentally different place. Not perfect. No technology can eliminate human suffering or solve all of our problems, but authentic in a way it hadn't been for decades. The official story, as reported by governments and media outlets, is that there was a massive computer network failure that affected communication systems worldwide. The collapse of various criminal organisations and corrupt political networks is attributed to increased law enforcement cooperation and citizen activism. The sudden flowering of human creativity and the emergence of previously suppressed technologies is explained as the natural result of improved global communication and education. But those of us who know the truth understand what really happened. Humanity was freed from a form of enslavement so subtle that most people never realised they were enslaved. The Black Goo Phenomenon, the consciousness manipulation programs, the vast network of mind control operations, all of it existed in the shadows between what people were allowed to know and what they were programmed to ignore. Max Spears died trying to expose this truth, but his death was not in vain. The investigation it sparked, the network of freed individuals it created, and the ultimate liberation it made possible represent the most significant victory for human consciousness in recorded history. Of course, the story isn't over. There are still those who remember the old systems and dream of rebuilding them. There are still pockets of Black Goo technology hidden in remote facilities around the world, and there are still questions about the true origins of the consciousness manipulation programs and the identities of those who created them. But for the first time in decades, these are problems that humanity can face with clear minds and authentic consciousness. We are no longer fighting a war we didn't know we were in. We are no longer slaves who believed we were free. The Black Goo may remember and it may evolve, but so do we. And now that we know what we're fighting, now that we understand the true nature of the battle for human consciousness, we will never again allow ourselves to be so completely deceived. Max Spears is gone, but his legacy lives in every liberated mind, every authentic thought, every moment of genuine human connection that would have been impossible under the old system of control. He gave us back our souls, and we will never forget the price he paid to do so. If you're listening to this story, if you followed it to its conclusion, then you are part of that legacy. You are one of the free minds, one of the awakened consciousness, one of the humans who will ensure that what was done to us is never done again. The war for human consciousness is over. We won, and the future, for the first time in living memory, truly belongs to us. Sweet dreams, fellow travellers, and remember, you are finally, authentically, completely free to dream your own dreams. This has been another investigation into the hidden corners of our reality, brought to you by Sleep Theories. If this story has opened your mind to possibilities you hadn't considered before, please subscribe and share it with others who are ready to question the nature of their own consciousness. The truth, as Max Spiers knew, is always worth fighting for. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay free. The video quality was poor, shot apparently with a hidden camera in low-light conditions. But what it showed was extraordinary. A group of individuals in dark clothing gathered around a table, covered with electronic equipment and glass containers filled with black liquid. The audio was largely inaudible, but I could make out fragments of conversation that included references to consciousness transfer, archetypal programming, and phase transition protocols. Most disturbing was a whispered phrase that was repeated several times throughout the recording. The goo remembers, it evolves. The video ended abruptly, but not before showing one of the participants holding up a vial of the black substance to the light. For just a moment, the liquid seemed to move independently of the container, forming patterns that looked almost like hieroglyphics or code. I spent weeks analysing the video, enhancing the audio and trying to identify the location and participants. But before I could make significant progress, disaster struck. I'd been working on a comprehensive article about Max's research and death, planning to publish it on my blog and distribute it through various alternative media channels. The article contained everything: Max's final communications, the testimonies from Elena and other Milab survivors, Latchford's revelations about the military research, and my own investigation into the cover-up surrounding Max's death. But the moment I clicked publish, everything went wrong. My website immediately went offline, displaying only an error message about content violations. My hosting company claimed that the site had been taken down due to security concerns, but wouldn't provide any specific details. When I tried to contact them directly, I was told that the matter was being handled by appropriate authorities. My backup files, stored on multiple cloud services and external drives, had all been corrupted or remotely deleted. Years of research, hundreds of interviews, and thousands of documents, all gone in a matter of hours. The message was clear: whatever forces had silenced Max Spiers were now silencing his story as well. But they had made one mistake. In their rush to contain the information, they had overlooked the fact that I had already sent copies of key files to several trusted contacts in the alternative research community. Within days, fragments of Max's story began appearing on forums and websites around the world. The response was swift and predictable. Debunking sites published detailed critiques of the Max Spiers conspiracy theory, pointing out inconsistencies and casting doubt on the credibility of witnesses. Social media accounts that shared information about the case were suspended for spreading misinformation, and one by one, the people who had spoken to me about Max began recanting their statements, or claiming they had been misquoted. Eleanor Miles disappeared entirely, her phone number disconnected and her last known address abandoned. Cyrus Latchford published a statement claiming that he had been suffering from early-stage dementia, and that his conversations with me had been the product of confused memories. Even Dr. Anna Kowalski in Warsaw sent me an email stating that she had made errors in her recollections, and that Max's death had been entirely normal. It was a masterclass in narrative control, and it was almost completely effective. Within 6 months, Max Spiers had been transformed from a martyred truth seeker into a cautionary tale about the dangers of conspiracy thinking. But the truth has a way of persisting, even when it's been officially erased. In the years since Max's death, I've continued to receive messages from people who claim to have had their own experiences with Black Goo Phenomena, MILAB survivors who report similar substances being used in their abductions, researchers who have found references to consciousness manipulation programs in leaked government documents, and most disturbingly, individuals who claim to be experiencing the same symptoms that Max described in his final recordings: memory distortions, electronic interference, and the gradual sense that their own thoughts are no longer entirely their own. If you're hearing this story, if you've made it this far, then perhaps you're ready to consider the possibility that Max Spiers wasn't crazy. Perhaps he was simply too close to a truth that some people will kill to protect. And perhaps the war he described, the war for human consciousness itself, is still being fought, even if most of us don't realise we're on the battlefield. The Black Goo Phenomenon, whatever its true nature, represents something fundamental about the world we live in. It suggests that reality itself might be more malleable than we assume, that consciousness might be more vulnerable to manipulation than we want to believe, and that there are forces at work in our world that operate according to rules we don't understand. Max Spiers died trying to expose these forces. His story was buried, his research destroyed, and his memory tarnished. But the questions he raised remain unanswered, and the phenomena he investigated continue to manifest in the lives of people around the world. Whatever the truth about the Black Goo, whatever the reality behind the Millab accounts and the consciousness manipulation programs, one thing is certain. The war for our minds is real, and it's being fought in ways we're only beginning to comprehend. If Max was right, if they've learned to weaponize consciousness itself, then we are all potential targets, and the only defense we have is awareness, the recognition that our thoughts, our memories, and our perceptions might not be as secure as we believe them to be. So remember Max Spiers, remember his warnings, and remember that in a world where reality itself can be programmed, the most radical act might simply be the decision to think for yourself. The Black Goo remembers, it evolves, and somewhere, in laboratories and facilities we'll never see, the war for human consciousness continues. Are you still dreaming, or are you finally ready to wake up? The summer of 1998 was suffocating in suburban Ohio. 10-year-old Silas Greer lay in his bed, sheets kicked off, staring at the ceiling fan that barely moved the thick air. Sleep was a stranger to him then, had been since he was 7. While other kids his age were dreaming of baseball and bicycles, Silas was discovering the strange world that existed after midnight, when the normal rules seemed suspended and the impossible felt possible. That's how he found Coast to Coast AM. Art Bell's voice was like a beacon in the darkness, smooth and knowing, speaking to the insomniacs and the curious, the believers and the skeptics. Silas had discovered the show 3 months earlier, accidentally, when his father's radio had been left on after a late-night fishing report. Now it was ritual. Every night he'd tune in on his small transistor radio, volume low enough that his parents wouldn't hear, but clear enough that Bell's voice could carry him through the endless dark hours. July 29th, 1998. A Wednesday night that would change everything. Bell was in his element that evening, fielding calls about UFO sightings in Nevada, discussing the latest conspiracy theories about Area 51. Silas had heard it all before. The show had its regular callers, its familiar rhythms. But then Bell's voice took on a different quality, more serious, more intrigued. Folks, I've just received a fax that's, well, it's something else entirely. This comes from someone calling himself John Titor, and he claims to be writing from the year 2036. Silas sat up in bed, suddenly alert. Time travel stories were common on Coast to Coast, but there was something in Bell's tone that suggested this was different. Now, I've read a lot of these over the years, Bell continued, but this one is remarkably detailed, remarkably specific. Let me read it to you. The fax was unlike anything Silas had ever heard. This John Titor person spoke with clinical precision about future events. A civil war that would tear the United States apart by 2005, a mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer from 1975, something called the Many Worlds Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics. But what struck Silas most was the voice behind the words. Even filtered through Bell's reading, there was something desperate about it, something urgent. "I am a time traveller from the year 2036, Bell read. I'm on my way home after getting an IBM 5100 computer system from the year 1975. My time machine is a stationary mass temporal displacement unit powered by two top-spin dual positive singularities that produce a standard offset Tipler sinusoid." The technical jargon washed over Silas, but he grabbed his notebook, the one he kept for recording interesting things he heard on the show, and began sketching. He drew timelines, tried to capture the dates Titor mentioned, the strange sense of inevitability in his words. "The Civil War in America will start in 2005, Bell continued reading. By 2015, Russia will launch a nuclear strike against the major cities in the United States, China and Europe. The US cities are destroyed along with the AFE American Federal Empire. The European Union and China will also be destroyed. Oddly enough, Russia is not a target." Silas's pencil moved frantically across the page. Something about this felt different from the usual coast-to-coast fare. This wasn't someone looking for attention or trying to sell a book. This felt like a warning, like a message in a bottle thrown across an ocean of time. But then something strange happened. The broadcast began to experience interference, static that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Through the white noise, Silas could swear he heard another voice, fainter than Bell's but distinct. It sounded like it was saying something, but the words were lost in the electronic snow. Bell paused in his reading. "We're having some technical difficulties here, folks. Bear with us." The static continued for nearly 30 seconds, and then cleared as suddenly as it had begun. Bell resumed reading, but Silas noticed something odd. The flow of the text seemed different now, as if something had been skipped over. "Well, that's quite a fax," Bell said when he finished. "John Titor from 2036. If you're listening, John, give us a call. I'd love to hear more about this time machine of yours." But no call came. The show moved on to other topics, other mysteries. Silas, however, remained fixated on what he had heard. He spent the rest of the night filling his notebook with questions, theories, timelines. There was something about the Titor facts that felt unfinished, as if the static had interrupted something important. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself returning to those notes again and again. He checked the official coast-to-coast archives, but the version posted online seemed shorter than what he remembered hearing. Some of the details felt missing, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. The summer ended, school began, and life moved forward. But Silas never forgot that night. Never forgot the urgency in those words read by Art Bell's familiar voice. He kept the notebook, even as he grew older, even as the memory began to feel more like a dream than a real experience. He had no way of knowing that 27 years later, he would discover that his childhood memory was more accurate than any official record, and that the missing pieces of that broadcast would lead him into a conspiracy that stretched across decades and possibly across time itself. 2025 arrived with the same quiet desperation that had marked the previous few years. Silas Greer, now 37, and bearing the weight of too many sleepless nights, worked in a building that didn't officially exist. Division Calder occupied 3 floors of a nondescript office complex in McLean, Virginia, hidden beneath the innocuous nameplate of the Federal Data Compliance Agency. His job title was Classified Systems Analyst, which meant he spent his days diving into the digital archaeology of government databases, tracking down corrupted files, fixing network vulnerabilities, and occasionally stumbling across information that reminded him why his security clearance came with a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. The work suited him. It was methodical, solitary, and allowed him to disappear into the intricate puzzles of data systems. Most importantly, it kept his mind occupied during the day, which made the sleepless nights marginally more bearable. On a Tuesday morning in March, Silas was conducting a routine audit of the division's network infrastructure when he noticed something unusual. A relay node in the deepest part of the system was showing signs of corruption. Not the usual degradation of old hardware, but something more deliberate. The corruption patterns were too regular, too purposeful. Following the digital breadcrumbs, Silas traced the compromised node to an offline vault he had never seen before. The access path was buried beneath layers of security protocols, and the vault itself was labelled with a designation that made his pulse quicken. Orpheus 99, Titor Incident, Division SP Delta. Titor. The name hit him like a physical blow, dragging him instantly back to that summer night in 1998, to Art Bell's voice reading impossible words from an impossible source. For 27 years that memory had lived in the back of his mind, a strange childhood fixation that he'd never quite been able to shake. His hands trembled slightly as he initiated the access protocols. His clearance level was sufficient, barely, but he had to route through several proxy servers to avoid triggering automatic monitoring systems. Whatever was in this vault, it was meant to stay buried. The files began to populate on his screen, and Silas felt his worldview tilt on its axis. Operation Echo Prism was the primary designation. The associated documents painted a picture that was both impossible and terrifyingly plausible. The files contained logs referencing Temporal Incursion 001, codename TITOR, along with directives marked Retroactive Suppression and Narrative Severance Protocol. But it was the audio file that stopped his heart. The file was labelled Coast to Coast AM 072998 uncut.wav and was significantly larger than any archived version of that broadcast should have been. Silas's hands shook as he downloaded it to a secure partition and opened it in an audio editing program. Art Bell's voice filled his headphones, exactly as he remembered it from that night 27 years ago. The familiar cadence, the careful reading of the Titor facts. But as the broadcast progressed, Silas began to notice discrepancies. The version he was hearing was longer, more detailed. The static that had interrupted the broadcast was there, but it was different, more structured, more purposeful. And then, as the static cleared, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Another voice, faint but distinct, speaking over the interference. Not Art Bell's voice, but something else entirely. The words were distorted, but with some audio manipulation, Silas was able to enhance them. "They found me. I never meant to be here. Don't trust the timeline. It's being rewritten." The voice was desperate, terrified, and it was definitely not part of the original broadcast. Silas sat back in his chair, staring at the waveform on his screen. This was impossible. The file was clearly authentic. The metadata showed it was recorded directly from the coast-to-coast AM broadcast feed. But this enhanced version contained material that had never been publicly archived. He spent the next several hours diving deeper into the ORPHEUS files. What he found painted a picture of a government operation that defied everything he thought he knew about reality. Project Locust Veil appeared to be some sort of information warfare initiative, designed to suppress or alter public perception of specific events. The Titor incident was listed as the final uncollapsed vector in a series of what the files called temporal anomalies. The document suggested that the John Titor who'd sent that fax to Art Bell was not a hoax, not a creative fiction, but something far more dangerous, a genuine disruption to the timeline that had required immediate containment. According to the files, the original broadcast had been intercepted and edited in real time. The version that was archived and distributed publicly had been carefully sanitized, with the most alarming elements removed. The static that Silas remembered was actually the sound of the timeline being corrected, whatever that meant. But perhaps most disturbing of all was a series of voice print analyses comparing the mysterious second voice in the static to various archived recordings. The analysis showed a match to 3 encrypted internal calls, all made from phones within government facilities. One of those calls was time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. on July 29th, 1998, the same night as the original broadcast. Silas stared at the screen until his eyes burned. If these files were genuine, then everything he thought he knew about the Titor incident was wrong. The hoax wasn't John Titor's claims about time travel. The hoax was the cover-up, a carefully constructed narrative that had been designed to make the truth look like fiction. He made copies of everything, storing them on encrypted drives and hidden partitions. Something told him that his access to these files wouldn't last long. Whatever Division Calder was really doing, and whatever the truth about John Titor really was, powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it buried. As he prepared to leave the office that evening, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The familiar paranoia of his profession had taken on a new intensity. He had always known that information was dangerous, but this was different. This felt like he had stumbled across a secret that could rewrite history itself. That night, for the first time in weeks, Silas didn't have trouble sleeping. But his dreams were filled with static, with voices calling across impossible distances, with the growing certainty that the past was not as fixed as he had always believed. The obsession consumed him. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself spending every free moment analysing the Orpheus files, comparing the uncut broadcast with public archives, and trying to piece together a timeline that made any kind of sense. He started with the basics. The original Coast to Coast AM broadcast from July 29th, 1998, was publicly available in multiple archives, but when he compared these versions with the uncut file he'd discovered, the differences were subtle but unmistakable. Entire sections had been removed, not just edited, but completely excised from the historical record. The public version of the broadcast ran for exactly 47 minutes and 32 seconds. The uncut version was 51 minutes and 18 seconds long. Nearly 4 minutes of material had been removed, and the editing was so seamless that it was impossible to detect without a direct comparison. But it wasn't just the length that was different. The content itself had been altered. In the public version, Titor's message was presented as an interesting curiosity, a well-crafted piece of science fiction that Bell read with his usual mix of skepticism and entertainment. In the uncut version, Bell's tone was different, more serious, more concerned. There were moments where he paused, as if he was grappling with the implications of what he was reading. "Folks, I have to tell you," Bell said in the uncut version, "this is unlike anything I've ever received. The level of detail, the technical specifications, this doesn't read like someone's creative writing project. This reads like a field report." Those words didn't exist in any public archive. Silas began to dig deeper, tracking down early internet discussions of the Titor incident. He found references to the original broadcast in archived Usenet groups and early web forums, but many of the most detailed discussions had been removed or altered. It was as if someone had gone through the early internet with a fine-toothed comb, systematically removing or modifying any reference to the uncut version of the broadcast. The more he investigated, the more convinced he became that the Orpheus files represented a massive information warfare operation. Someone with significant resources and access had gone to extraordinary lengths to alter the historical record of the Titor incident. But why? What was so dangerous about John Titor's message that it required this level of suppression? The answer came when Silas began analysing the metadata embedded in the ORPHEUS files. Hidden within the digital fingerprints of the documents was a wealth of information about their origins and the people who had created them. The files had been compiled by something called the Temporal Anomaly Research Division, which appeared to be a joint operation between the NSA, the CIA, and a private contractor called Meridian Dynamics. The project had been running since 1947, originally focused on what the files called chronological inconsistencies, events that seemed to violate the normal flow of cause and effect. The Titor incident was classified as a Type 7 temporal anomaly, defined as direct communication from an alternate or future timeline. According to the files, the government had been tracking and suppressing temporal anomalies for decades. The Titor incident was significant because it was the first time such an anomaly had occurred in a public forum, broadcast live to millions of listeners across the country. The files contained detailed analysis of Titor's message, breaking down not just the content, but the linguistic patterns, the choice of words, even the rhythm of the sentences. The conclusion was unanimous among the analysts. This was not a hoax. The message showed signs of what they called temporal displacement syndrome, linguistic patterns that suggested the author was experiencing time in a non-linear fashion. But perhaps most disturbing was the section labelled Containment Protocols. The files outlined a comprehensive plan to discredit the Titor incident through a combination of disinformation and narrative manipulation. False information would be seeded into online forums, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims that would make it impossible for anyone to determine what was real and what was fabricated. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when someone calling themselves John Titor began posting on internet forums, the narrative had been so thoroughly corrupted that the real message was lost in a sea of science fiction and hoax claims. Silas spent hours studying the forum posts attributed to John Titor, comparing them with the original facts that had been read on Coast to Coast AM. The differences were striking. The forum posts were elaborate, entertaining, and full of the kind of time travel technobabble that science fiction fans loved. The original facts was terse, technical, and terrifying in its implications. The forum posts were the disinformation campaign. They were designed to turn John Titor into a figure of fun, an internet legend that no one would take seriously. The real John Titor, the one who had sent that fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But who was he? And where had he come from? The answer to that question would lead Silas down a rabbit hole that would shake his understanding of reality itself. The first sign that Silas had attracted unwanted attention came on a Thursday morning in late March. He arrived at his desk to find that his security badge had been downgraded. Not revoked entirely, but his access to certain systems had been restricted. When he tried to access the Orpheus files, he was met with an error message he'd never seen before. Access denied, subject classification under review. His supervisor, a thin man named Carson, who rarely spoke and never smiled, appeared at his cubicle within minutes. Greer, there's been a security audit. Some irregularities in your access patterns. Nothing serious, but you'll need to stick to your assigned projects for the next few weeks while we sort it out. Silas nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Of course, whatever you need. But Carson's eyes lingered on him for a moment too long, and Silas got the distinct impression that this was not a routine security audit. Over the following days, the surveillance became more obvious. His computer would crash at exactly 2:11 a.m. every night, regardless of whether he was using it or not. The crashes were too regular, too precise to be coincidental. Someone was monitoring his system and shutting it down at predetermined intervals. His attempts to communicate with the outside world were also being interfered with. Emails to friends and family would bounce back as undeliverable. His phone calls would drop after exactly 3 minutes. Even his internet searches were being filtered. Certain keywords would return no results, while others would redirect him to innocuous websites. But it was the woman in the slate trench coat who confirmed his worst suspicions. She appeared on Monday morning, standing across the street from his office building. Tall, professional-looking with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stood in the same spot for exactly 15 minutes from 8:45 to 9 a.m, then disappeared. The next day she was back, same time, same position. By Friday, Silas had confirmed the pattern. The woman appeared every morning at 8:45 a.m. and every evening at 5:15 p.m. She never looked directly at the building, never made any obvious attempt to observe him, but her presence was too regular to be coincidental. On the following Monday, everything changed. When Silas arrived at his desk, he found a message on his computer terminal. Not an email, not a system notification, but a text file that had been placed directly on his desktop. The file name was simply readme.txt. The message inside was brief. Dr. Lenara Voss, former DoD temporal linguistics analyst, presumed dead in 2016. Titor wasn't a hoax. He wasn't first either. He was the last natural variable. Underground parking garage level B3 tonight at 11 p.m. Come alone. Bring the files. Silas stared at the message for a long time. Dr. Lenara Voss was a name he recognised from the Orpheus files. She had been one of the lead analysts on the Titor project. According to the documents, She had died in a car accident in 2016, but her analysis of the temporal anomalies had been instrumental in developing the containment protocols. If she was alive, and if she was reaching out to him, then everything was about to change. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and anticipation. Silas went through the motions of his normal routine, but his mind was racing. He made copies of all the files he'd discovered, storing them on multiple encrypted drives. If this was a trap, he wanted to make sure the information would survive him. At 10:45 p.m, he made his way to the underground parking garage. Level B3 was normally deserted at this hour, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast long shadows between the concrete pillars. The place felt like a tomb sealed off from the world above. She was waiting for him near the elevator bank, but she looked nothing like the woman he had seen across the street. This Dr. Lena Voss was in her 50s, with greying hair and the kind of exhausted look that came from too many years of carrying dangerous secrets. She wore a simple black jacket and jeans, and her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the shadows for threats. "You found the Orpheus files," she said without preamble. "How much do you know?" "I know that the Titor incident was real," Silas replied. "I know that someone went to extraordinary lengths to cover it up, and I know that you're supposed to be dead." She smiled grimly. "Death is a relative concept in this business. I've been dead for 9 years, and it's been the safest 9 years of my life. Until now." "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone with access to the Orpheus files has been poking around, asking questions, making copies. That someone is you, and now they know about me too." Silas felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are they?" "The people who have been managing the timeline for the past 70 years. The people who decided that certain events needed to be erased from history. The people who made sure that John Titor became a joke instead of a warning." She gestured for him to follow her deeper into the garage, away from the elevator and the security cameras. When they reached a secluded corner, she turned to face him. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible," she said. "But you've already seen the evidence. You know that the official story is a lie. The question is, are you ready to learn the truth?" Silas nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready for anything. "John Titor was real," she continued. "He really was a time traveller from the year 2036, but he wasn't the first. There had been others, small incursions, temporal anomalies that we were able to contain and cover up. Titor was different because he went public. He sent that fax to Art Bell, and suddenly millions of people knew about temporal displacement." "But the timeline," Silas said. "If time travel is real, wouldn't his presence in the past have already changed things?" "That's the thing," Voss replied. "The timeline is more resilient than most people think. Small changes get absorbed, corrected by the flow of events. But major disruptions, public knowledge of time travel, that's different. That threatens the stability of the entire temporal framework." "So they killed him?" "They tried to, but Titor was smart. He knew they were coming. That's why he sent the fax to Bell. It was a dead man's switch, a way to ensure that the truth would survive even if he didn't. But it didn't survive. The broadcast was edited, the story was discredited. That's what they want you to think. But the truth has a way of persisting even when people try to erase it. That's why you found the ORPH-EUS files. That's why you're here now, talking to me." Silas was quiet for a moment, processing what she had told him. What happened to Titor? That's the question, isn't it? According to the official files, he was neutralized. But there are other files, deeper files, that suggest something different. Something that would explain why the timeline has been so unstable lately. What kind of instability? Small things. Events that don't quite line up with the historical record. People who remember things differently than they're supposed to. Temporal echoes that suggest the past is not as fixed as it should be. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. This is a temporal resonance detector. It measures fluctuations in the time stream. Watch. She activated the device and the screen filled with a complex waveform. The pattern was chaotic, full of spikes and valleys that seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm. "This is what the timeline looks like now," she said. "Unstable, fractured. Something is wrong with the fundamental structure of causality itself." And you think this is connected to the Titor incident? I think John Titor didn't just travel through time. I think he broke it, and I think the people who are trying to cover it up are making it worse. She handed him the device. Take this, monitor the readings. If I'm right, if the timeline is continuing to degrade, then we need to do something about it before it's too late. What can we do? We find the truth. We find out what really happened to John Titor, and we figure out how to fix the mess that's been made of history. As if on cue, the lights in the parking garage flickered and went out. In the darkness, Silas could hear the sound of approaching footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. They found us, Voss whispered. Run! The next few days blurred together in a haze of paranoia and digital archaeology. Silas had managed to escape the parking garage that night, but just barely. Dr. Voss had not been so lucky. When he looked for news of her the next morning, there was no trace, no arrest reports, no missing person filings, nothing. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. But she had given him the tools he needed to continue the investigation. The temporal resonance detector confirmed what she had told him. The timeline was becoming increasingly unstable. The readings showed massive fluctuations, temporal distortions that seemed to be growing stronger by the day. More importantly, she had provided him with access codes to deeper levels of the Orpheus archive. Files that painted a picture of a government conspiracy that stretched back decades, involving not just the Titor incident, but a whole series of temporal anomalies that had been systematically covered up. The deeper files revealed the existence of Project Coronos, a black-budget operation that had been running since 1952. The project was tasked with monitoring and suppressing evidence of temporal displacement, but the files suggested that they had gone far beyond simple observation. They were actively manipulating the timeline, making selective alterations to history to maintain what they called narrative stability. According to the files, the Titor incident had been their greatest challenge. Unlike previous temporal anomalies, which had been private or localized, the Titor facts had been broadcast to millions of people. The normal containment protocols wouldn't work. Instead, they had implemented something called Narrative Severance Protocol, a comprehensive disinformation campaign designed to turn truth into fiction. The protocol had 3 phases. First, they would edit the original broadcast, removing the most convincing elements and replacing them with obvious fabrications. Second, they would seed false information into online forums and discussion groups, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims. Third, they would create a false Titor persona, someone who would post elaborate science fiction stories that would completely discredit the original message. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when the fake John Titor began posting on internet forums, the real message had been completely obscured. The public came to know John Titor as an internet legend, a creative hoaxer who had entertained people with elaborate time travel stories. The real John Titor, the one who had sent that desperate fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But Silas was beginning to suspect that the story was even more complex than the files suggested. The temporal resonance detector was showing patterns that didn't match the official timeline. There were echoes, repetitions, suggestions that certain events had been repeated or revised multiple times. He decided to take a risk. Using the access codes that Dr. Voss had provided, he began to search for the deepest files in the Coronos archive. What he found made his blood run cold. The files were labelled Uraboros Protocol, and they contained evidence of something that should have been impossible. The project wasn't just suppressing evidence of time travel. They were engaging in time travel themselves. The files contained detailed logs of temporal operations, missions to specific points in history to make selective alterations. The operations were surgical, precise, designed to change single events without disrupting the larger flow of history. But the cumulative effect was devastating. The timeline had been edited so many times that it was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And at the centre of it all was John Titor. According to the Uraboros files, he hadn't just travelled back in time once. He had made multiple trips, each time trying to prevent a different catastrophe, each time creating new problems that required additional interventions. The files suggested that Titor wasn't just a time traveller. He was trapped in a temporal loop, endlessly repeating the same mission, never quite achieving the results he was looking for. Each iteration of the loop created new timeline branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. But the most disturbing revelation was contained in the final file labelled Subject Profile, Titor, John, real name classified. The file contained biometric data, voice print analysis, and psychological profiles. But it was the photograph that made Silas's world collapse. The face looking back at him from the screen was older, more weathered, but unmistakably familiar. It was his own face, aged by decades of impossible experience. John Titor was Silas Greer. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Everything suddenly made sense. His lifelong insomnia, his fascination with the original broadcast, his ability to access the Orpheus files. He wasn't investigating the Titor incident. He was the Titor incident. The temporal resonance detector in his pocket began to vibrate frantically. The readings were off the charts, suggesting a massive temporal event was about to occur. Around him, reality began to shimmer and distort, as if the fabric of time itself was coming apart. He understood now why the timeline was so unstable. His presence in the past was creating paradoxes, contradictions that the universe was struggling to resolve. Every time he learned more about his own future, he created new branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. The government agents who had been hunting him weren't trying to stop him from revealing the truth. They were trying to prevent him from completing the loop, from becoming the John Titor who would send that fax to Art Bell. But it was too late. The loop was already closing. He could feel it, the pull of destiny, the weight of events that had already been set in motion. In that moment he understood that he had never had a choice. He had been following a script that had been written decades ago, playing out a role that had been predetermined by the laws of causality itself. His last act was to upload everything he had discovered to a series of encrypted servers, hidden in the deep corners of the internet. The files would survive, even if he didn't. Someone else would find them. Someone else would piece together the truth. He typed a final message, his fingers moving with the certainty of someone who had written these same words countless times before. The 5100 was a tool. The broadcast was the ignition. I didn't travel time, I broke it. And now I see everything. The loop was me. As he hit send, the world dissolved around him, reality collapsing into a single point of impossible light. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was his own reflection in the computer screen, but it was different now. Older, wearier, bearing the weight of knowledge that no human mind should have to carry. John Titor was gone. Silas Greer was gone. But the loop continued, as it always had, as it always would. Somewhere in the multiverse, a 10-year-old boy was lying in bed, listening to Art Bell read a fax from a time traveller who claimed to be from the year 2036. The message would always be the same, the warning would always be ignored, and the loop would always close. Time, it seemed, was not a river flowing in one direction. It was a circle, endlessly repeating, endlessly consuming itself. And at the centre of that circle, a voice called out across the years, desperate and urgent and forever unheard. Don't trust the timeline, it's being rewritten. In the end, that was all that remained. The echo of a voice that had been erased from history, the ghost of a man who had tried to change the past, and had only succeeded in ensuring that it would happen exactly as it always had. The Titor files would be discovered eventually, pieced together by someone else who couldn't sleep, someone else who heard voices in the static. The truth would surface, as it always did, but it would be dismissed as fiction, as fantasy, as the delusions of someone who had spent too long staring into the abyss of classified information. And somewhere in the darkness between one moment and the next, between one timeline and another, the loop would continue, eternal and inescapable, a temporal Uraboros devouring its own tail. The listener had remembered. The listener had become the message, and the message would always be the same.